We're at the end of the Conjugal Dictatorship, and this video is going to be about chapters 15, 16, and 17. They are about the ways in which Marcos tried to legally legitimize his power and how he planned to rule in perpetuity. It's an interesting last three chapters because it kind of puts it all together in context and summarizes everything that's come up to this point in the book. As we remember, this book came out in 1976, and so it was only around 3.5 years into the martial law administration of Marcos. So reading the book in that perspective helped us better see just how much of what it says was kind of continued on throughout the rest of the administration, as well as how some of the things it predicted eventually did come true in varying ways, which we'll get into much later. Some of them are quite eerie as well. But it really just proves just how well Primitivo Mijares knew Marcos, and how a lot of the things that he seems to be saying in the book were probably for the most part true, given just how well he was able to predict how Marcos's administration would continue moving forward. Chapter 15 is about how Marcos, again, tried to legally legitimize his power through two main things. One is through the Supreme Court, and the other one is through citizens' assemblies. The Supreme Court, I don't want to get too much into the details of what exactly went on, but you can read it in chapter 15. But the Supreme Court in varying ways allowed for, say, the suspension of writ of habeas corpus, and for the allowing for Marcos to continue being in the powerful position that he was in. And how the book describes why the Supreme Court allowed this to happen was that they were, on one hand, afraid of losing their jobs because there's a sense that Marcos could very easily replace them if they were to go against him. And so to some degree, they were trying to protect themselves, and they felt like they had no choice either way. They would just be replaced by someone else who would vote for the way Marcos would want, and so what was the point? They might as well keep their jobs. There's that on one hand, and the other was that Marcos actually, towards the Supreme Court, towards members of the government, was constantly threatening them, saying that if you don't support me, what's going to happen is that there will be a military junta and a revolutionary government that will come out if you don't support me on my issues that I'm trying to present. And so it was a bit of like a veiled threat of sorts that if you don't support me, there'll be a revolutionary government. And so putting people in these very kind of awkward positions, and as well as the fact that many of them are probably just trying to keep their jobs, or at least that's what they were trying to say to themselves. The Supreme Court, in varying ways, allowed for Marcos to legitimize his control and power. Although the author of the book, Primitivo Mijares, says that because of just how tainted the whole process was and how there was so much bribery behind the scenes and all this stuff and threats to losing their jobs, it can't really be seen as legitimate. So that's one of the arguments. So one of the arguments of Mijares is that the Supreme Court stuff, obviously can't be legitimate given all the threats to their positions. The second one is the citizens' assemblies. Now, what are these? So after martial law was declared, a few months after, Marcos wanted to present to the world and to the country itself that martial law was something the Filipinos wanted, the Filipinos accepted, and people chose Marcos to be their leader, and they wanted to do whatever it takes to rid the threat of, say, communism or the threat of Muslim insurgency movements in the South. And so there were these citizens' assemblies where supposedly around 1 million or 2 million people came together and voted on certain issues. One of them was whether they wanted to ratify the Constitution, or they wanted to allow the Constitution to be approved. This is the 1973 Constitution. According to Mijares, these citizen assemblies votes were all falsified. So this idea that the people in the Philippines wanted martial law to happen based on the citizen assemblies, which showed around like an 85%, I think, approval rate, they were all falsified according to Mijares. And so if you were to see that Marcos's claim to power, where it was twofold, one was through the Supreme Court, the other one was through the public, through the citizens' assemblies, Mijares says both of them were kind of like illegitimate. And so what he was really trying to say was that, Marcos's rule was totally unconstitutional and without any legal basis. That's one of his arguments of the book. The second one that goes into in chapter 16 was that if you look at the way in which Marcos presented the Constitution, what he was really acting on in the moment, he seemed to have no intent of relinquishing power, meaning he wanted to be in power forever. How do we know this? One of the things that he did was that he removed this provision in the 1973 Constitution that would have allowed for there to be a successor to him. that there would be this kind of plan in place that would say, well, if Marcos becomes incapacitated, gets assassinated, who will be the next in line? According to the book, there was no next in line based on the 1973 Constitution. And when people would ask him, or when people would press on, like, well, what is the plan? What happens if something happens? What's the plan for succession? Marcos would simply say, oh, it's a secret. The reason why I cannot divulge what the secret is because if I say what the plans for succession are, I'll be more prone to assassination. People will know what positions to try to lobby for they want to get so they can be in power one day. And so he needs to kind of keep it secret, apparently. He said that if something were to happen to him, if he were to be assassinated or whatever it is, the plans which are already in place would immediately be enforced. I think Mijares seems to suggest that there are no plans in place, or that if there are any plans in place, they were probably, not really, they're probably something like giving it to Imelda or giving it to his own son or something. But given the fact that there was no transparency in the succession plans, it seems like Marcos really had no intention at all of ever not being present. He wanted to maintain power forever as long as he could kind of hold it. Chapters 15 and 16 go into this stuff in much, much more detail, again, about like just how Marcos how much he cared about his image to not just the local kind of public, but to the foreign press as well. And so a lot of this stuff really drills in this idea that Marcos wanted to do whatever it takes to be seen as a legitimate president. He would do stuff like antedating documents. There's lots of like what I guess today would be described as historical revisionism, even when he was in power in the mid-70s, to make it seem as if people were always for him. People always wanted him to kind of be in power, and the Filipino people loved him and all this stuff. And again, Mijares would know, of all the people, Mijares would know the best because he was his chief propagandist, in his words. He wrote daily columns for Marcos, so his main job for several years was legitimizing the power of Marcos in the eyes of the public, or trying to convince the average person that Marcos was doing what's best for the country, martial law is good, and that other Filipinos love it as well. And so if all the parts of the book that I feel like you may be wondering whether or not Mijares would know about, in case you ever had like a skeptical mind when reading the book, I feel like the stuff about propaganda and about legitimization of Marcos's power are the ones that you could see as most accurate, because that's what he was most involved in. So that's the end of the book, really. Going into chapter 17 is really the end, and I think it's called The Wither Marcos, where it really just tries to summarize all the things that could happen in the future that I found very interesting. For example, apparently he said that there was this theory that martial law would end in 1981 because the proclamation of martial law was 1081. So it was like martial law for 10 years and it'll end in 1981, which it actually did technically. Well, on paper it ended in 1981, then he kind of pushed it back. So I don't know if like he did always plan it to kind of go to 1981, but that's one random thing he said in the last chapter. And okay, chapter 17 has a lot of stuff where it's a combination of like projecting what the future would look like and drilling in again his main point, which is to tell American people, to tell the American business community, to tell the American government that you cannot continue to support martial law because of X, Y, and Z. And so it summarizes everything and all the problems. And this is, I'm going to read a part of the book, which I found very interesting. This is what he says, where the reasons why Marcos would never want to lift martial law. He gave 4 reasons. Number 1, it is part of a plan to perpetuate himself in power. Number 2, fear that he would offend the military, who wouldn't want to lose their powers now. 3, fear he would offend sectors of the military which he has misled into going along with him on the imposition of martial law in the honest belief that there was a real escalating rebellion. On the other hand, some military officers have sworn an oath of personal loyalty to Marcos before martial law was proclaimed, and now they are afraid to go back on it. Number 4, Imelda, Kokoy, and Benedicto would advise him against it, realizing, as they do, that the moment the coercive process of martial law is removed, they will lose their ill-gotten wealth and their heads to the irate citizens. It says here, further on, if the pressure builds up against the martial regime, Marcos will lift martial law in name only. He will go through the motions of revoking Proclamation 1081 and 1104, and on some auspicious occasion or date, like his birthday or the natal day of Mrs. Marcos, and present such act as a gift to the Filipino people. However, the situation will not change. It will be the same dog with a different collar. Restrictions imposed upon the proclamation of martial law will be retained. So this is what it seems like ended up happening, where in 1981, martial law was lifted in name, and then a lot of the things that was going on in society maintained the same, at least according to what I've read and other stuff. Now, it's interesting to kind of get everything together in the last chapter, because we learned again about, it kind of reminds me again about how a lot of this book is directed towards the American public. So, for example, one of the things that seems like the reason why martial law was allowed by the American business community was that the idea was that there was a lot of chaos in the Philippines, and therefore martial law was required, or at least it was necessary for the business community to maintain feeling comfortable maintaining business in the country, because it's a more stable environment. That's one of the supposed arguments on the side of the business community why they would want martial law to continue. And according to Mijares, he says, well, if that was your reason, it's not going to be stable for long, because all of this stuff going on in the government is very corrupt. All the ill-gotten wealth, all the ways in which Marxists kind of ruling the society, the country, will, and this is the argument of the book of one of the parts of this chapter, is that the Philippines will end up falling to the communists. So he in a way, again, martial law was advanced supposedly as a way to stop the spread of communism, but Mijares himself uses the communist threat because maybe this is what's most present in the American mind as the reason why you should stop supporting Marcos. According to him, Marcos is going to lead to the communist revolution. The communism will really spread throughout the country because of Marcos. Because the country will go into so much chaos, and whenever the country falls into chaos, it gets into the hands of the communists and they take over. So that was an interesting argument. I don't really know how true that is, but it is true. I've read in other stuff that the communist threat, again, as we know, was mostly exaggerated in the beginning of martial law, but it actually did grow over time throughout the end of the 80s, where I don't know the extent to which in 1975 it was actually I don't think it was strong at all, but the idea that he would say that the communist rebellion of sorts of revolution would become stronger in the event of Marcos's continued rule was to some degree true, I guess, even though it was never, I don't think it was ever really as strong to kind of really take over the whole country, but I don't quite know too much about that. Now, it also kind of introduces another character to this Marcos story, which is Steve Sinakis, who was the son-in-law of, or brother-in-law of Jenny Lopez, who was the son of Eugenio Lopez, the guy who was supposed to be the kingmaker or the president maker of the Philippines. And it kind of put us to the end of this book in the sense where I have become a little bit more skeptical about this whole thing because, well, I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it. I feel like it's interesting to read the book knowing that he is clearly on the side of one political faction of the country, which was the Lopezes, who were, I feel like I have a very difficult time feeling sympathy for the Lopez family while reading the book, knowing just how much of a powerhouse they were in the country. Again, literally the guy who was the head of the Lopez clan was the president maker because he had so much political control and sway over the way that the news cycles in the country worked, that whoever he decided to support would become president, and he supported Marcos, and that's how he became president. And it's hard for me to feel sympathetic to people who had so much power in this pre-Marcos society, the people who were continuing kind of putting the country in a very rough situation, because the country didn't fall into disarray during the Marcos administration only. It was always going through many different issues, which we just unfortunately don't know too much about because we're not as educated about. But things were not all peachy, in the years of, El Pidio Quirino or something, or whatever. Like, things were quite messy for a while. And so, I feel like a lot of the things that the book says are probably true and probably accurate, but it does fall into lots of exaggerations and hyperbole, and I feel like it's a bit of a shame because it's making me think, like, is this book, written in this way because he was, like what was rumored in one of these US WikiLeaks documents, actually being paid by the Lopezes? I don't know, but overall, I think I learned a lot from the book, and it was overall, I think, worth reading just get a better sense of what martial law was like from the perspective of many of the people on the anti-Marcos camp.